Howdy folks, welcome to the Daily Coin. My name is Rory and today is Sunday, April the 2nd, 2017, and I have the great honor and very distinct pleasure of welcoming back to the show Mr. Bullion Bulls Canada himself, Mr. Jeff Nielson. Jeff, welcome back.
Hi, Rory. It's nice to be back again.
Well, I'm glad you're here. We've got a lot on the table all of a sudden with gold and silver and China and Russia seemingly moving closer together and bringing an actual gold market to the table. And I just found out just a couple of days ago, by way of the Daily Economist, he had published or posted a video, but in that video, they were talking about a gold currency that's being used on an app called WeChat in China. And during the Chinese Lunar New Year, which is a week-long celebration, they moved $14.5 million, over 100 million renminbi worth of gold currency. Not gold-backed currency, but an actual gold currency. And that really got my attention. This is on top of learning about China and Russia moving towards a gold-backed currency that's traded through the alternative to the SWIFT system in China and in Russia. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, so first thing I want to do is back up in time a couple of years or so to when I was first doing clips, shortly after you started doing the Daily Coin. And we talked about the issue of China moving to a gold-backed currency.
Yep.
And so the point I wanted to really stress back then was that we could never have a situation where China would back the renminbi with gold and then move to assume the role of reserve currency. And the reason that it could never happen in that sequence is because if there was ever a choice in the global marketplace between holding a paper-backed US dollar versus a gold-backed renminbi, what we would have seen would have been the greatest monetary stampede in human history out of the US dollar and into the renminbi. And a stampede of that force and magnitude would have been almost as harmful for China as for the US. So what we have to see in this transition is we have to see China first assume the effective world reserve currency role, and then it can introduce an official fully gold-backed currency. So with what you're talking about here now, we're seeing China putting in place not an official gold-backed currency, but a parallel currency, a parallel gold currency, more along the model of what Hugo Salinas Price has been talking about for many years in Mexico. And but it's this intermediate step that makes it so much easier to move from a paper monetary world to a gold-based monetary world, because it's kind of like getting people's toes in the water.
Exactly.
So I look at something like this, and of course, as we've also discussed in the past, and I'm sure you've discussed on your own, China has been steadily moving closer and closer towards that reserve currency role. It's already the reserve currency for a number of Asian nations, and it's been doing these trillions of dollars worth of currency swaps and bilateral trade agreements all over the world, which exist for one purpose only. Every one of those deals results in a permanent discontinuation of the use of US dollars for that particular segment of trade, replacing it with the use of renminbi instead. And so, we've seen this steady transition, and now, with the introduction of this gold currency, parallel currency, it really does seem like they're getting really close to doing the two things: a, assuming the official role as the world's number one currency, and then going the important step further and creating a gold-backed currency.
If we go back to the beginning of 2016, Koos Jansen published an article about the prime minister or one of the officials in the upper echelons of Kazakhstan meeting with the director of the Shanghai Gold Exchange for the specific purpose of introducing gold as a trade currency along the new Silk Road and how to implement that. So we have more pieces coming online every single day to move away from the dollar and to move towards a gold backed currency or a flat out gold currency, as what we're already seeing. $14.5 million worth of gold currency is no small amount. I mean, in the grand
No,
scheme of things, it's a drop in the bucket. But in real world terms, that's a lot of currency, and
it's a lot of gold. It's a
it's
lot
a
of
lot
real
of
gold.
gold, and it's real gold. So the article that I wrote around all of this was pointing out the fact that the federal government here in the United States has gotten to be very belligerent towards Russia, and they're turning their belligerence towards China. And it seems like now we know why, because of all of these attacks in the background against the Federal Reserve note. Am I on target with that, Jeff? Is that the bigger picture of what the belligerence is all about, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I would agree with you, except so when you present it, in that time frame, it almost makes it look like China and Russia have quote unquote provoked the United States. And of course, that's, as we both know, the total opposite of what's really been going on. And so, I step back again and I look at the big picture, historically, in terms of why do empires fall? Why is there this cyclical thing of rising and falling of empires? And of course, it's the same process that always takes place. You see a major power rise, and generally they rise, of course, because they're doing something right. It's there's few empires that were totally based on military dominance. We have to go all the way back, basically, even before the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was much more than just a military empire.
Yes.
So you see these empires rise and they fall. Why do they rise and they fall? So they're on the way up. They're doing things right. They're in some respect at least producing genuine positive change in the world. The Roman Empire brought order, it brought education, it brought all sorts of advancements to the world. But then, of course, when these empires reach their zenith, corruption starts to set in. It's the old line about absolute power breeds absolute corruption. So the corruption starts to set in, and then what happens? These empires start to feel vulnerable. So when they feel vulnerable, excuse me, that's when they become much more militaristic. It's what we saw with the Roman Empire, and it's what we saw to a lesser extent with the British Empire. I mean, they got involved in all sorts of wars as the British Empire was on the way down. And of course, it's what we see with the American Empire. But now, if you look at the other side of the coin in terms of what other nations are doing, could we have ever seen an entity like BRICS come into existence if not for this relentless belligerence emanating from the US and its Western Empire?
Probably not.
So, I mean,
There would
this
be
is
no
the whole.
need for it.
No, and of course, these aren't. It's not like these are nations that were historic allies. They're spread all over the world, and of course, China and Russia have been, enemies as much as they've been allies. Going back historically. So, I mean, there would have been no likelihood of these nations forging this quasi alliance on their own. This economic cooperation, and of course now we have the Silk Road. None of this stuff would have happened if these nations hadn't been pushed into it. And of course, in your own article, you talk about the new currency systems that Russia and China have created, and in Russia's case, it was totally pushed into doing this because it was threatened to be kicked out of SWIFT.
Yep.
And of course, you know, flashing back to that, I mean, that was hilarious because the U.S. had been working for months to get Russia thrown out of SWIFT. And then just as they were about to do it, China and Russia go public with, oh yes, China's got its SIPS system ready to go, ready to launch at any time. And then, you know, all of a sudden there's this massive reversal. And not only are they halting all efforts to throw Russia out of SWIFT, but they actually offered Russia a board seat to get it to stay. And
Oh Lord.
And I mean, so it's this whole Wile E. Coyote thing where you've got this totally evil entity that's got all these schemes that it's plotting and launching, and then they blow up in its face, and it looks like an idiot.
We're looking pretty stupid right now. I mean, we're on the world stage. I mean, I don't know. Just as a side note, I mean, Lavrov came out and called out the UN a few days ago for the opium production in Afghanistan, and said, "Why is there so much opium coming out of Afghanistan? Hasn't the U.S. military been in there for like ever? And what's going on with that? Why is that? I
Or
mean,
to put it in more specific terms, why did opium production in Afghanistan go in a straight line upwards from nothing to the global leader after the U.S. military went in there?
thank you. And now we have a heroin epidemic worldwide because of it. It's no coincidence, but I digress. You just published a new article where you are not attacking, but you are pointing out how devastating the loss of Obamacare on the Trump side is to his power, and it shows that he has no power. Period. And it was a clear message from the oligarchs. If you would, Jeff, just elaborate on that and tell us where your head is and what you see with Trump and where he's at right now.
Well, if we go back to the U.S. election process, of course, we had this two-horse race where the front runner kept switching back and forth, and I mean, as with everything else to do with the U.S. political scene, it was all total theater. But for me, I looked at that as Trump's education, and so he got the Republican nomination. He thought he was a big wheel, and of course, then he had to run up against Hillary and the machine she had, the oligarch funded machine she had. And in the early months of the campaign, he was getting chewed up. And so, meanwhile, of course, behind the scenes, what was obviously being whispered in his ear was, how badly do you want to make it to the White House, Donald? And so, of course, whisper, whisper, whisper. Well, the next thing you know, Trump brings on a Goldman Sachs money man. Oh, and the next thing you know, he gets rid of his independent campaign manager and brings in a Washington insider. Well, we saw how much he wanted to be president. But of course, I think Trump still thought to himself he could play things both ways. He could use the establishment to grease the wheels to get him into the White House, and then he could still be president of the United States when he got into the Oval Office. And so, that was for me what the vote about Obamacare was all about, was to, give Donald Trump a wake-up call and to let Donald Trump know that, hey, you don't run the United States, you're only the president.
Right, you're just a figurehead.
Yeah.
You say what we tell you to say, and that's about it. You don't stop all this tweeting and stirring the pot, then things may get ugly for you. And here's how ugly they can get.
And so basically, with this major humiliating defeat at the beginning of his presidency, he's already, got a very difficult choice to make. He's either got to be the oligarch's boy, just like Obama was, because that's how you win votes in Congress, and that's how you actually look like you're the president. Look like you're actually the leader of the nation rather than just some mouthpiece.
Right.
Or he can still try to be Donald Trump, president of the United States, on his own, and see how far that gets him. And as people are going to see in the piece that I'm just going to have published in the next day or so on this. I mean, my point of view is that if he suffers one more humiliating defeat, he's already a lame duck.
I don't know that he's not already at this point.
Well, but see, I
I
think
mean,
that
unless he rules by executive order. If he rules by executive order, then he can make some things happen, over the until the end of his first term. At the end of his first term, he will not be reelected. The executive orders that he put into place will all disappear. Period.
not only that, but of course, there's no better way for a lame duck president to advertise that they're a lame duck president than to go the executive order route over and over again. I mean, it's essentially an implicit declaration that they don't have the cojones to win a vote.
Is this just the deep state, shadow government, whatever you want to call it, oligarchs, the one bank as you refer to them? Is this just them pushing their agenda into the White House? And how do you see the first part of this conversation tying into what we're discussing right now? Is there any correlation between us going to war with Russia, China, or both, or North Korea?
We could very easily say that the reason that it was important to deal Trump this humiliating defeat right early on in the presidency is because the oligarchs want to find out for sure one way or another whether he's going to be their boy or not. Not sometimes pay lip service, say the right things when he's behind closed doors, but whether when he gets in front of the camera, he's going to be saying what he's told to say and not doing his usual shoot from the lip ad libbing. And so I think that this is, kind of like the moment of truth for Trump in terms of what he's going to be. A big mouth independent that blows up, and crashes and burns on a spectacular manner, or whether he's going to become another Obama and yes sir, no sir, and do exactly what he's told, because as you've been saying, the U.S. has been doing this saber rattling with ever more intensity for several years now. Of course, nobody's been covering that better than Paul Craig Roberts, and so, but in order to follow through, they need a leader who's not going to flinch and who's going to do what he's told. And I don't think that they're there yet in terms of looking at Trump that way. And so if they decide he's not the guy, if they decide that he's just too much of a loose cannon, and of course that's a very likely possibility, well, what happens there? Do they try to stall on their agenda for the 4 years of the Trump term and then put a new puppet in place that'll do what they want? Or do they get more radical and look to make some midterm change? I mean, it certainly wouldn't be the first time they've sought to pull off a coup in the United States.
No, it would not. I mean, there's a lot of people that have said that he could get the Kennedy treatment, or they may allow an impeachment process to be brought to the table.
Yeah,
Say
yeah.
that he's mentally unstable. Yep,
Put the vice president in place because they know he'll do what he's told,
exactly.
and not uh, try to wing it on his own.
Right. He'll just take the script and that's it. Thank you very much. I'll take my $60 million book deal now.
Indeed, that may have been for the oligarchs. That may have been one of the most important motivations for them to take control of his campaign, was so that they had input into who his running mate was going to be.
Well, excellent point. Gold and silver. I want to stay on that. How do you see the market action of late, Jeff? I mean, we've gold and silver are up. I was listening to Eric Sprott and Craig Hemke yesterday, and I think that gold's up 8% in the first quarter, and silver's up 13%. So that's a nice first quarter. And do you see things kind of moving along these same lines? Do you think that we're going to get kind of uh, bump from what's happening in China and Russia?
Well, of course, in 2016, I laid out a very specific scenario. I called it the fake gold rally and
Yep.
said basically they would be marching the market up till around mid-year. And the purpose of marching it up in the first place was to set it up for a crash. And so, I mean, that's been done, but it wasn't a crash. What we saw instead was a retreat, much more moderate pullback. And now we're seeing, some upward momentum again, but much more, of course, moderate than at the beginning of last year. So I asked the question whether this reflects ambivalence on the part of the oligarchs planning, because the scenario I described and what actually unfolded through the first half of 2016, it was basically bang on. And of course, the further part of my reasoning was that they were setting up the gold and silver market for a more general crash, so that when they took the the stock markets down and the general markets down, they could crash gold and silver along with it and not have them look like quote unquote safe havens. So, but there was no crash. Instead there was the Trump rally, and they pushed the
Right.
bubbles up even further after the election. So, the question becomes, is this part of the oligarchs' plan all along to keep pumping markets up past their normal 8-year bubble and crash cycle? Or are they actually having cold feet? And, they would like to pull their crash routine so they can reset markets and then create their next bubbles, because of course they profit on the way down as well, and then they can profit back up, going back up the next bubble cycle. Because as we've discussed before, as the orchestrators of these bubbles, once you pump the bubbles up to certain levels, there's no more money to be made for the crime syndicate. Most of the new money going into these bubbles is their own money. And of course, that's not how you profit. So there's no incentive for the crime syndicate to continue to pump these market bubbles up higher, yet they haven't taken them down yet. So why? Are they afraid? Do they have some bigger plan that's, they're just waiting for the wheels to, fully the gears to fully move into place before they launch it? I mean, I can't give them credit for that sort of planning, because we haven't seen any indication of thinking on that sort of level of sophistication. Instead they've been much more reactionary. So, I would say that this is seeming to indicate ambivalence on the part of the oligarchs, that maybe what they're going to be doing is pumping the markets up again further, and of course maybe allowing gold and silver to run up a little further, so they're once again poised for a good crash. And then they're going to have to decide whether they've got the guts to pull the trigger. They couldn't do it in 2016. Can they do it in 2017?
I don't think
Sooner
they
or later
can.
they have to, because they're not making any more money off their bubbles.
Now, I would say it's probably. I think you're probably right as far as the equity side. They're probably pretty close to having all that they can get from that. And
And the other thing, let me just step in here for one more second. And the other thing, of course, is the Federal Reserve and the interest rate cycle. So, of course, they've had those lying mouthpieces spend 8 years saying, yes, we're going to normalize interest rates. Yes, we're going to normalize interest rates, and basically not doing anything. Well, finally, over the last year or so, they've begun to start nudging rates higher. Well, that doesn't seem to be something that can be reversed. And of course, with uh, these economies so extremely leveraged on debt, and these markets so extremely leveraged, you cannot boost up interest rates without rupturing the bubbles. So, automatically, whether they plan it or not, if interest rates continue to inch higher, it's game over for these bubbles. So, that also lends more credence to the idea that the bubbles are going to be popped sooner than later, because they are grudgingly allowing interest rates to inch higher ever so slowly.
well, if they were to allow interest rates to quote normalize, it would, at their current pace, it would take 20 years or more to get back to, somewhere in the 5 to 7% range, which is normal. So they can talk about normalizing all they want, and I mean, I think that if they continue to play the games with the interest rates that they have been, if they continue to raise interest, Fed fund rates, they're going to crash the market, period. And President Xi Jinping, is meeting with Trump this week. And what are the odds that the gold discussion will be on the table, or is it going to be nothing but North Korea, South China Sea, all the distractions from the real story?
Well, I would suggest that if there is any talk between the U.S. and China about gold, that it'll all take place when Donald Trump's not in the room, because a he wouldn't understand it, and b his masters don't want him thinking along those lines. They don't want to give him ideas. So it's certainly possible that some of the officials that are going to be part of the entourage for the two teams are going to have, and of course that always happens anyways. They're going to have their own parallel talks, and it's very possible that there'll be information exchanged on the gold market at that time. But I certainly would not expect to see any headlines about Donald Trump talking gold with China.
He likes gold. I mean,
Well, but
he's conducted business in gold and vowed at the time that he signed off on some 30-year lease that he did in gold, that he was going to do more, and that he didn't trust the U.S. dollar. He didn't think that it was, and this was in 2012 or something, 2011.
but that's all the more reason that they would not want Donald Trump sitting in on talks about what's really going on in the gold market.
Well,
You
that
know,
makes sense.
last thing you want is to have uh, somebody with the shoot off the mouth potential of a Donald Trump actually knowing what's going on.
Wouldn't it be
You know,
cool if he did?
he can shoot off his mouth now, but of course he just looks like an idiot because he has most of his relationships and cause effect uh, relationships backwards. But I mean, if he actually uh, was sitting in on high level talks, talking about what's really going on in the world and the real geopolitical dynamics between these nations, that would make him much more dangerous to his masters than he is right now.
Yeah, and then he would probably suffer the same fate as Kennedy,
Yeah, and I mean quickly because
and quickly.
he's too unpredictable. At least Kennedy was a thinking man. Trump is just shoot from the lip.
Yeah, he does that a lot. And well, Jeff, is there anything that you would like to leave the good folks with at this point?
Well, I just wanted to spend a moment and talk about a four-part series I did for Sprott Money that was titled "When the Tidal Wave Hits," and um, the reason I did that series was to try to give people a wake-up call because for the people who have been part of your audience, part of my audience for several years, I think that it's so easy to get a little bit sleepy and a little bit uh, apathetic because we've been talking about essentially the end of our economies as we know them, possibly the end of our governments and even our societies as we know them. And we've been talking about this for several years and nothing's happened. And it's so easy for people to hear that sort of a drumbeat year after year and think to themselves, well, maybe they were exaggerating or nothing's ever going to happen, or it's going to happen a long time down the road. And, so the purpose of that series was to, get several stories across. The tidal wave is coming. That our economies are destroyed. It's only the capacity for manipulation and the propaganda that's allowed these train wrecks to hold together for as long as they have. And so our way of life is going to change when this collapse occurs. And of course, parallel with that, we have our entire society from a legal standpoint being turned upside down with this quote unquote war on terror, this orchestrated fascism to allow our governments to turn our societies into police states to supposedly quote unquote fight the terrorists.
Open air
And
prisons.
Yeah, and so we have these things going on. So I mean, this is all real, and I mean, it's hasn't stopped. It's not like everything's been suspended. It's continued to move forward. It's just that the oligarchs have gone out of their way to keep things quiet. So our economies have continued to deteriorate. The war on terror has continued to escalate. Our rights have continued to be shredded, and of course the fascist agenda continues to get more and more belligerent from a military standpoint. So everything we've been talking about, rather than saying, "Oh well, we were exaggerating," or "It's going to be a long time coming." Well, no, it's going to be worse than we first thought, and it's getting closer and closer, as we've been talking about, of course, during this clip, because we can see things coming to a head in many respects. So I think it's really important for people to understand that you know rather than things having cooled off or somehow even gotten better, that it just means we're much, much closer to the abyss than we were when we first started talking about this 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, people ask, all the time, when is the collapse going to happen? I mean, there was one of my family asked me that exact question, and I looked at him and I said, "Well, we can either look at 1913 or we can look at 2006. Take your pick." Said it's happening right now. It's all around you. The collapse is happening right now. It's not an event. It is a process. And that process is quickening at this point. The pieces are coming into view when you start to see a gold currency come to the table. Something's changed. Something major has just changed. Period. When you see a nation that has the largest military in the history of the world being as belligerent as they are with this military firepower, then something has changed. And if people can't see that, then please go over. If you don't want to, please don't take my word for it. Go to shadowstats.com, look at the inflation rate chart, look at the unemployment rate chart, and tell me that we're not in a depression. We are not in a recession. And this is something that you talked about with Dave, and something that I've been saying for at least a year, that we are in a full blown depression. The numbers support it. The economic deterioration supports it. The facts, the actual facts, not the nonsense that comes out of TV, those facts support a full blown depression. Am I right or wrong?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, there's a totally surreal aspect to this because with their propaganda, with their capacity to manipulate markets, they've been able to pretend in their public front that everything is treading water. Or of
Green
course, in the
shoots.
case of the U.S., it's going up and up and up.
It's green shoots as far as the eye can see.
But meanwhile, the reality is we're in this relentless crumbling of our economies. So,
Yes.
so the surreality is that what's going to happen is that we're going to be presented with what's going to be billed as a sudden, surprising, rapid collapse, when in fact what's really going to be taking place is it's just going to be taking the blinders off and actually showing the train wrecks for what they really were. And it's not like our economies are going to suddenly go off a cliff in 3 months. It's, as you pointed out before, they already went over the edge. They're already falling, but we're not going to actually have the blinders taken off until they're an inch above the ground.
In 2006, that's when everything really started falling apart. That's
No doubt.
when things started collapsing. And then in
In the U.
2008, everything did collapse, period. The derivatives market was on the edge of getting away from them. And if they hadn't have stolen 16 to 23 trillion dollars from the American public, then the derivatives market would have blown apart, taking with it the entire global economy. There is nothing that's been changed, nothing has been corrected or fixed. 16 to 23 trillion dollars was sucked up in less than a year, and they have thrown an additional what? 4 trillion. It's on the balance sheet, Federal Reserve's balance sheet. They
And
did.
that's just the official money
It's
printing,
the
because of course
official. It's
what
ridiculous.
is always lost in the fog is the fraud of fractional reserve banking. So the
Right.
Federal Reserve conjures $4 trillion out of thin air at 0% interest, feeds it into the big banks, who then can lend out that 4 trillion at a 35-to-1 ratio at 0% interest.
That's 1.2 quadrillion.
So that's yeah. Well, no, that's over 100. That's just over, with one bank, it's just over 100 trillion. But then they lend their 100 trillion to Bank B at 0% interest, and Bank B gets to lend that out at a 35-to-1 ratio. And now suddenly you're into the quadrillions. Added two more banks into the chain, and you're into the quintillions. And this is all legal
It's
counterfeiting.
ridiculous.
This is all legal counterfeiting that was made possible by the original fraud of the Federal Reserve pretending to quote unquote lend money at 0%, because there's no such thing as a 0% loan. By definition, an interest rate is a positive number. It's the price we pay for the use of capital. So there's no such thing as a 0% interest rate. There's no such thing as a negative interest rate. These are just crime terms that the crime syndicate uses.
Well, if you anybody that thinks that there's a negative interest rate, how can that is not even physically possible? That's called theft.
Yeah, it's a
Negative
total.
interest rate is called theft. I mean, I'm gonna lend you, Jeff, $10,000, and what I want you to give me back is 9,500,
Or less.
or less. Okay, so what part of stealing is that outside of? That is pure theft. It's not a negative interest rate. It's theft. I mean, I don't know. Now I'm getting all
They
wound up.
used the 0% interest rate. They used the 0% interest rate to be able to legally counterfeit infinite quantities of funny money, and they're using the negative interest rate to get even more fascist with their economic oppression.
To steal even more.
Yeah, on top of what they already steal implicitly with the inflation.
It's just, oh, so if you
And
want
then,
to
and then,
know,
of course, we haven't even talked about the war on cash, where they're going to force us to put all of our wealth into the banks, so that all of this wealth is captive to be stolen by inflation times or inflation plus negative interest rates.
right, theft plus theft.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
and going back to what I was saying earlier, this is why empires collapse,
Right.
because as they get corrupt, they become fearful. As they become fearful, they get desperate. As they get desperate, they do the things that cause the empire to collapse.
And that's exactly what's happening. So if you want to know when the collapse is happening, simply look out your window. It's happening
In slow motion.
in slow motion. Well, Jeff, I certainly appreciate all your time this afternoon. This has been great. It's been a great, it's been too long since we last spoke, and I can assure you that we're going to correct that going forward. And we may have some pretty exciting stuff coming up in the near term on something completely different for the folks. If you're willing to do that.
Oh, for sure. And we can just leave them with that teaser for now.
Exactly. And you can find Jeff's work over at sprottmoney.com and bullionbullscanada.com. Jeff, thank you very much for all your time today.
Always a pleasure.